Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Welcome to the plenary session of Day 2, Futures Literacy Week International Conference. My name is Michiko from the Office of International Affairs and Global Network, Chulalongkorn University. I'm delighted to join you all. So in our first plenary session today, we'll be hearing presentations from student co-facilitators of the Futures Literacy Lab. The lab took place virtually during the past 3 days as a co-designed program between Chulalongkorn University and UNESCO under the theme of reimagining learning and knowledge on climate change, climate action, and climate justice. Some 30 Thai and international students based at several universities in Thailand participated in the lab. The lab co-designing process was spearheaded by Associate Professor Dr. Carl Middleton, Director of the Center for Social Development Studies in the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University, and Ms. Christine Kavazanjian, Practitioner and Designer of Futures Literacy, Research Policy and Foresight, and her colleague, Ms. Sally Lin, UNESCO Paris. And the lab was generously supported by UNESCO Chair for Future Studies for Sustainable Policy Making, based at Westminster International University in Tashkent. This process-oriented program provided an opportunity for intensive reflection and evaluation of self-assumptions of key themes among the selected participants. And it was designed in such a way that the perspectives and findings from this process would feed into the discussions of international conference for further reflections on the related topics. So now I'd like to call upon Christine to facilitate the session. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Michiko, and thank you to all for inviting us to talk to you about this wonderful experience. As Michiko mentioned, we just ran a 3-day Futures Literacy Laboratory whose topic is more relevant than ever. And this was really a collaboration in the true sense of the word. So we hope to tell you all about it, and at the end of our session today have an opportunity for you to ask us some questions. So without further ado, I think maybe we'll just start with a round of introductions so you know who's here, and I will maybe just start to kick it off. So I'm Christine, and I work as a practitioner and designer for Futures Literacy at UNESCO. My primary role is designing and implementing labs, but of course work with UNESCO chairs to expand the Futures Literacy Network and run different activities around the world that we will talk to you a little bit about as well. So maybe I'll pass it to Sally to go next.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm Sally. I work as a Futures Literacy designer and facilitator, also at UNESCO. I mainly focus on lab co-design and implementation in the Asia region, but also in urban settings. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Over to Carl.
Thanks very much, Sally. My name is Carl. I'm the director of the Center for Social Development Studies in the Faculty of Political Science of Chulalongkorn University, and also a lecturer on the International Development Studies program, which is an MA and PhD program in the Faculty of Political Science. And I teach on development studies and also on environmental politics. So I've been keen to engage in this process of creating the Futures Literacy Lab together with everybody in the session today. Shall I hand over to a co-facilitator and we pass around? Maybe go for the top left-hand corner of this poster. Can I hand it to Resham?
Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Resham Badri and I'm a master's student at the International Development Studies program in Chulalongkorn University, and I've been one of the co-facilitators at the FLL.
Hi everyone, I'm Jizong Ang. I'm a master student of international development study from Chulalongkorn University and part of co-design and facilitators. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Miranda Rolfe and I'm from the Social Policy and Development faculty at Thammasat University.
Andrea, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea. I'm also in Chulalongkorn University in Foresight Strategy in the Faculty of Architecture. And I was a co-facilitator during these last 3 days.
And Chanti?
Hi, my name is Chanti Soinet. I'm PhD student at EDS, Environment Development Sustainability at Chulalongkorn University. I am also the co-affiliator for the last couple of days, and great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, I also see that James has joined us. Over to you, James.
Sorry, but there's so much ambient noise. I'm outside. So I'm James from the MUS program, like Andrea. And I was also a co-facilitator in the past lab. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. So for this session, we will be diving into some questions with our facilitators to reflect on the lab that you've heard on. But just before we go into that, we wanted to give you a bit more context as to just exactly what is Futures Literacy and what exactly is a Futures Literacy Lab. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you. So you saw that wonderful video that summarizes futures literacy. So just to elaborate a little bit, what is futures literacy? It's a skill. It's a skill that attempts to allow us to understand the role of the future in the present. So how, what do we perceive and how might we act based on those perceptions? We often make a comparison to traditional literacy, reading and writing, financial literacy. And what these literacies have in common is that they represent capabilities around understanding and effectively using different skills for different reasons. And of course, they're capabilities that can be learned and improved over time. So in the context of futures literacy, we look at how we anticipate, how and why we anticipate. Are we anticipating to plan and prepare? Or are we anticipating for something that does not yet exist? So I know that I want to learn, but I'm open to, where and how this learning might take place, for example. So, both, of course, are equally important. We have to plan, we have to prepare, but we also have to learn to be open enough to not let that planning constrain us when we're faced with uncertainty. So you might be wondering how all of this works in practice, and we will get there. So maybe I pass it to Sally to contextualize a little bit about the actual structures of the lab.
Thanks, Christine. Exactly like Christine said, futures literacy itself is a skill. So then you might ask, in what setting can we learn or become exposed to this skill to practice it and become more familiar and get better at it? Then in that case, the Futures Literacy Laboratory is the primary approach to developing futures literacy. It is a structured process that focuses on 4 different phases But there are two things that are really emphasizes. The first one being collective intelligence, the idea that when we put all of our brains together and think together, we get more ideas, we get to share different perspectives, and that gets us further. And the second one being that it is co-designed. So all of our facilitators that had introduced themselves, and Carl also, we had gone through several sessions of co-designing, what is the topic of the lab? How do we structure the lab? What sort of questions are we asking? All of these nuanced details all together to make sure that the lab is tailored for our unique local context. In this case, bringing together students from different Thai universities to discuss climate change, climate action, and climate justice in the future. So on that note, I'm going to show you the sort of 4 different phases that go into the lab. The first phase, we call it tacit to explicit, which essentially just means we make sure that we are rendering explicit. We're really laying out all of our anticipatory assumptions. So the way we think about probable and preferred futures as we know them, as it's influenced by our experiences. We then move on to phase 2, which is if we think of the lab as a learning journey or a learning curve, is a really steep part of the learning curve, because we developed a future scenario, a reframed future scenario that is not likable and not likely, and we intentionally use it to serve as a provocation for creativity. So in a completely unfamiliar future than our probable and preferred, for participants to play with and invent new anticipatory assumptions or new images of the future that we have. This is followed by, on the 3rd day, phase 3, where we get to come back and reflect on phase 1 and phase 2 and ask new questions to see what has changed for us, if there are new perspectives that we gain, and quickly followed by phase 4, which is the next steps, and which again depends on what each partner is looking for, each group that we work with is looking for. And in this case, we wanted to reflect on not only our learnings from the 1st and 2nd day, but also look at what are individual actions that young people can start to take in the present now in order to address climate change. So there's a bit of context for the lab. We'll bring it back to our first slide to look at, okay, now that we know the structure of the lab, why is it important and who might it be for? Christine.
Thanks. So yes, why is it important? Well, I think we can all agree that we live in pretty challenging times. Being in our 3rd year of a pandemic, we're facing war, we're, in climate extinction. The IPCC report that just came out was a tough one to swallow. So, we have, of course, made progress over time, but what is abundantly clear is that the future is uncertain, and we will continue to face these challenges, things that, as much as we plan, as much as we prepare, we have to be ready for what is unexpected. And so what we try to do as we develop this capability of futures literacy is help us, instead of rejecting uncertainty, instead of fearing uncertainty, actually teach us how to adapt, how to embrace that uncertainty, and even lean into it. Just to give a little bit of context. And so who is it for? Futures literacy is for everybody. The future is a common good. It belongs to us all. And by engaging, anyone who is interested in thinking about the future on any topic, it allows us to explore and shape it the way we would like to. So.
And we can take a quick look also at sort of the global context for futures literacy. going to just maybe point out that there are 32 UNESCO chairs in future studies and futures literacy, Chulalongkorn University in Thailand being one of these significant nodes in one of the most recent additions to this network of UNESCO chairs that is advancing futures studies and futures literacy all around the world. And so the efforts and the work that this university is doing contributes to a global learning network. In addition to that, UNESCO has also organized over 100+ futures literacy laboratories all around the world. And so speaking to Christine's earlier point about who is FL4 is quite diverse in terms of who are the participants who is looking to understand the futures from equity deserving communities in Canada to youth in Northeast Asia, youth in Thailand, and also to different private sector and nonprofit organizations. So just giving you a bit of the overall context around futures. Christine, if you have anything to add, please do. Otherwise, I think we're ready to move into questions.
Yeah, let's dive right in. So, yes, now we want to hear from our wonderful co-facilitator. So as mentioned, we designed this Futures Literacy Laboratory together. That's, one of the most important things when implementing or designing a lab is this notion of co-design. So we really want to, hear from the students in terms of your experience, both from in the co-design to the implementation of the lab itself. So maybe I can just start by asking, what were your impressions of futures thinking, and if you had any, experience prior, has that changed before and after being part of this Futures Literacy Lab from a co-design and implementation perspective? Maybe I can ask Risham.
Thanks, Christine. So yeah, like Christine mentioned, I came with no experience in futures thinking. So prior to the actual co-design process of the lab, after having heard about the futures thinking as a skill to challenge our capabilities and embrace the unknown future, it sounded quite overwhelming, to be honest, yet extremely interesting and challenging to be taken up. And the very basic idea of reimagining learning and unlearning, all that we have gathered so far through our empirical and other forms of knowledge, and putting all that aside and only taking the lens of the future without any sort of biases or assumptions seemed to be daunting at the start. However, as time unfolded with the ongoing co-design process over the month of February that we undertook, we started gaining deeper insights into the tools and futures thinking as a concept, and it was then much easier to digest at our end. And it, of course, broadened our horizons in terms of generating scenarios and playing within and beyond the constructs, which we tried our hands at. And it also ended up reorienting my outlook to understand the nuances of how thinking about futures is often neglected as we're so preoccupied with our day-to-day lives and we don't give it much importance. Also, the tremendous potential that it bears, I think it can really take us places if it is adapted and applied appropriately. And I would definitely like to say that I feel empowered to an extent to have delved into this kind of thinking and navigated through our wild and creative imaginations that we often untap. And especially all this with the lab participants was definitely a revelatory experience for me.
Thanks, Risham. That's super lovely to hear. I wonder if there is anyone else who would like to add a thought or two. So what was it like? What was your impressions or previous experience with futures thinking before the lab? And what do you think of it after the lab? Okay, hey, all good. If we want to come back to this later on. Thanks, Risham. I also want to mention that, what we shared earlier in terms of the lab structure, the 4 phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, is sort of, it's structured in the sense that we will always touch on these 4 phases in some way throughout a Futures Literacy Lab. But as you also know, emphasizing on co-design, as Risham has reflected on, how did you find that throughout our co-design process, these 4 phases was adapted? Anyone?
Should I take a shot? Yeah, so I think we try to apply a few design and critical thinking approaches to ensure that it brings out inclusiveness and innovation, as it was co-designed under the guidance of the UNESCO team. However, I think as co-facilitators and co-designers, we were offered a great opportunity to firstly come up with the objectives of the lab by itself, which allowed us to introspect, reflect within ourselves, and stimulate our thinking to an extent where we all came together to brainstorm and contextualize and mainly customize the lab based on our interest and our intended goals and vision around the area of Southeast Asia where we all come from. So we could definitely base or set the premise on the geography in this context. Secondly, I think the freedom that we got to apply the futures thinking tools, such as the causal layered analysis in shaping and framing the FLL outline to respond to our objectives, was indeed a great experience. Also, what I would say is I think the essence of the success of the lab would lie at the nexus of the flexibility that the tools offered us in terms of adapting to the different levels of the application and the broad scope of these tools that we could use to construe and prioritize the underlying concepts which are related to climate justice, climate action, and climate change. And mainly, I think the phase 3 of the reframe, we could adapt it to suit the lab objectives, whereby we brought out wild imaginative sides of the participants as they carried out a mock climate negotiation, where they could explore in the form of assigning personas to each of the groups, and then they had to negotiate by playing playing these roles as human or non-human entities and justify their existence in the chosen persona in the reframe future of 2050. So I think that really facilitated collective anticipatory thinking and developed a shared understanding of what are the systemic, non-systemic challenges that we would have to undertake in the reframe future. So that was definitely lovely to navigate through the unknown and the unexpected.
Thanks, Risham. I really enjoy what you said about flexibility as being a source of success, right? By embracing uncertainty as it comes up, it actually allows us to do better overall. And also, to give the audience more context, indeed, the mock climate negotiation was super creative, and the characters the personas that the participants actually came up with range from elders from Fiji to babies, to the bees, to the sun, and to personifying a river. And so you can only imagine how interesting, by bringing these different entities together, the conversation had gone. So thank you, Risham. Of course, on the flexibility part of the lab, while we're able to be adaptive, would anyone like to share if they saw any challenges come up during the implementation of the lab? So for example, was there something that did not go as planned?
I think I could try and tackle this question. So from my perspective, I think it was in the reframing process and the persona building, as well as the mock climate negotiations, where all the participants had such creative ideas that it was hard to limit the discussion to just half an hour or 40 minutes. And we found ourselves running out of time as well, and sort of having to quickly come to a decision because, like I said, everyone had such creative ideas.
Yes, it's definitely a challenge to kind of synthesize all of the different ideas while facilitating and ensuring that you're following the process. So I do want to mention that all of these students that you see on the screen, it was their first time in a Futures Literacy Lab and their first time facilitating. And so that already is a challenge, but you all managed to really, bring out the creativity from your participants. With the reframe, what we do is we give participants of the lab a very unfamiliar, strange future, and then we ask them to kind of make sense of it. And so that makes the role of the facilitator that much more challenging. And then of course you add the layer of doing this online. So you don't have the ease of, building off of each other's energy as we might do in person. So I just wanted to give you all a kudos for that. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to share with respect to, a challenge in facilitation, or something that they kind of adapted on the fly, or maybe even something that, went well?
I think a challenge has been that it was online, but I feel that actually the possibilities of using the online space was done really well. Using the Zoom, using the breakout rooms, being able to kind of cut and paste images and other sources from online, using online tools like Mural. But I feel there was also a slight bridging about as to what can sometimes be done in person was also done online. So to kind of try and convey a little bit of the spirit of the reframe process, the group that was taking on the persona of the river had the entire group as a whole sing a song about being a river, and that was fun and very convincing, even though we were distant via the Zoom, but still possible to have a lot of fun together.
I think of another challenge that may only happen in this lab or because we're in Chula, but this challenge was about everyone was keen on the subject somehow to some extent. So shaping ideas and getting people to be creative and think outside of the box when we only have academics, PhD, master degree students who have been passionate about the subject can be a challenge. We are not talking to children who are discovering material about climate change, but we are actually talking to people who have been eager to act and find new opportunities to, like foster ideas on what should I do next. And this could be a real challenge in the way that this lab was also a social experience and trying to, a journey to a future that does not exist yet. And people may have had trouble at first not being framed by all of the knowledge they accumulated already. Yeah.
Thanks. I'd just like to add, why do we emphasize so much, that creativity aspect? Well, I think we, especially as adults, we don't get enough opportunities to be creative and have fun. And of course, we learn when we have fun, and we learn when we are allowed to let go. And of course, the idea is to, detect potential novelty. What are the things that we see in this reframe scenario when we're kind of forced to get out of our comfort zone, which we might not see in our present day because we're faced with so much realities and challenges with our realities. So thank you all for sharing. Anyone else? I think the reframe was a big part of the lab, so definitely want to give any others an opportunity to share the experience around that.
Can I share something about it's not actually like the reframe, but you're thinking about the preferable future. So I found that there was an initial difficulty to encourage them to imagine like as you said, to think outside the box. So in my group, some members, they say that in the ideal future, human will be backfire with their activities, and there will be no more trees, for example. So when I say that, is that the most exciting, the most ideal future for you? They say that they cannot think of anything, you know, more optimistic. But you know, during the later step, like the reframe section, when they learn to let go and to be more imaginative, I found that the member in my team are more active thinking about their future, and as their reflection, they feel like they increase their ability to reshape the future after all.
Ooh, thank you. And would you also like to introduce yourself since you just came on?
So I'm sorry for joining late today. My name is Ha, and I am a PhD student in the Greek program in Chulalongkorn University, and I be in the group 1, like a co-facilitator in group 1 with Resham, and very nice to be here to share with you.
Thanks, Ha. No problem. We're just glad that you were able to make it and join us. And thank you also for pointing out, this is sort of exactly why we do the reframe futures, is that if we ask people to think about their preferred futures, and it's so constrained by our view of what is most likely to happen, that can be very challenging when we ask people just to simply imagine what they desire. And if we are not even able to imagine our desired futures, does that mean then, you know, how do we break away from this pathway of just going into what's most likely to happen? And so speaks to the value behind the reframe. So thank you all so much for the wonderful conversation and thoughts. Maybe we can also take a look, because when we are exploring things around creativity, whatever is new to us might come up as being very surprising. Was there anything surprising for any of you? It can be as a facilitator, or it can be just even what you got out of the lab personally.
Maybe can I thank him? So this is my first experience facilitating in such kind of a lab in here. So I always remind myself that I was not there to lead, I was there to facilitate. And I was surprised by the valuable contributions of participants from different professional background, academic background, and also different countries as well. And how we want to shape our futures in terms of climate change, climate actions, and climate justice. Also during the lab, in every phase, the active participation and contribution from all of the participants were incredible, and the lesson well structured by UNESCO team and our good design team. So personally, there is one role play, like a mock climate negotiation. I left this part very much, including the personal. I got the point like that all the creators have interdependence between it's time to do some changes for our art. And also I have come from a democratic background. I have gained a lot of new knowledge and different perspective for the next steps to take actions of climate change, climate action, and climate justice with the perspective of and human rights and marginalized communities as well. So finally, I'd like to say this opportunity. So thanks very much to Ajanka, the UNESCO team, and all of our co-design team members, and looking forward to joining another future literacy lab in the near future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's lots of important points actually you mentioned there. One of which is that when you're facilitating a lab, you don't actually have to be an expert in the field. I think, you know, what we try to emphasize is that you should care, you should be, you know, invested in the topic, similar, you know, as a facilitator, as a participant mostly, but you really don't have to necessarily have an expertise And when you facilitate, what we try to highlight is, listening skills. So how do you listen to what the participants are sharing, and how do you use that to guide the discussion? And I think another thing that you mentioned was that there are even, on one topic, there are multiple perspectives from which we can enter a lab. And what you all did as facilitators was you invited those different perspectives to kind of develop what we call collective intelligence knowledge creation, using those different perspectives to understand the different ways in which we might look at the challenges and the opportunities that come with climate change, climate action, and climate justice, and our knowledge of those topics. So thank you so much.
If I may jump in to add the reframe, it was really a turning point, probably in most of the groups. As we said before, like participants held onto reality, and the reframe brought great chaos to this previous thinking. Maybe people did not take the reframe too seriously at first, but in any event, they released their creative beasts to play as superhero bees, or knowledgeable babies, or sentient singing rivers. And when they were brought to this negotiation phase where they were all interacting as personas together, this is what surprised me a lot, is that naturally they came to synergy, an acknowledgement of these different actors being codependent. And, there had to be this solidarity among personas. They all deemed it was essential during the reframe to be accomplices and to have the solidarity for this reframe society to thrive. So in a way, they naturally went from, bounded reality where it was blurry what the future could be, and they couldn't be creative at all, to understanding the future of the anthropo-ecological system many entities would live in. So very interesting to come to such conclusion during a futuristic, weird reframe session.
Thanks, Andrea. Indeed, I think it's lovely to hear that it allowed us to think about our relationship with the environment and with nature differently by undertaking a creative exercise. And a lot of what Futures Literacy Labs is really looking to do also is not only for us to imagine different futures and be open to difference and to invent new assumptions and new images of the future, but also to use that sort of experience that we had in the future to look at the present differently, to think about what we can do in the now differently. And so with this sort of renewed understanding of our interdependence and interconnectedness with non-human and human entities, how does that then change the way we act? Which sort of brings me to the next question I'd like to pose to the group is, we already dove into some of the sort of insights of what you got out of experiencing the lab. If there are any others, we'd love to hear them. But what were these outcomes with relation to either futures literacy or on the topic of climate change or climate justice?
Shall I add a few thoughts? Are there others that would like to jump in?
Please.
I think it's kind of, a combination of outcomes and things learned that should make future outcomes as well, to be honest. And some of the points have already been mentioned, but maybe as somebody who's teaching within a university on development studies, I think that some of the things that we found in the lab are actually of quite profound consequence to how we should be thinking about teaching development studies and probably many other disciplines as well. I think the first has been mentioned, but I would just echo it, that we just don't give enough time to seriously think about the future. And I think even though much of development is about the future, we don't really have tools to think about the future. And just in the session I was in this morning, it was pointed out that we often look to the past to think about the future. And that kind of really, what we've done in the Futures Literacy Lab is change that thinking around totally and look to the future to think about the future and its relationship with the present. So I think as a perspective, so a perspective shift, that's an important outcome. I think the co-design process is an important outcome in itself. It's brought together a group that hadn't met before, or most hadn't met before, like we're across different universities. And I'd like to think that everyone will stay in touch. I felt that there was a coming together. In fact, it was already proposed, I think, that we will be meeting in person at some point once it's possible. So, I mean, I think that's an outcome in itself, like the networks of like-minded people coming together and wanting to do stuff together. I think that's important. And I think, I mean, what we heard in the final reflections of the at step 4 and concluding the workshop was that many of the participants said that, well, actually, it has changed my perspective on things as an outcome. There's many workshops where I think that doesn't really happen. So we were together for 3 days, 3 hours per day. It's not that long, really. So to actually take at face value that there has been a recognition of a desire for behavior change, for example, like that, I would say is an outcome itself. And perspective shifts. I mean, the reframe was really fun, but also in some ways quite profound. I was in, along with the group that was becoming the persona of a baby. And I found myself in the end really persuaded that babies have a lot to teach adults. So that's a genuine find, not just something that took on a persona, but rather thinking about the values in which babies bring to the world. So, I mean, I think in terms of an outcome, what does it mean for university programs? I mean, being involved as a university lecturer, I think this has to be put more into curriculums in the way that we, like the types of tools that we're teaching about and thinking about development studies, but then also as an exercise for students themselves. So not just teaching about it, but actually doing it as a part of class exercises. I think that I'm very persuaded through going through the process that that's a really important thing to do. And then just on the things about, so that's kind of the process in the lab and futures literacy. Just really briefly on climate change, climate action, climate justice. It's been, some of the outcomes have been mentioned already. I think perhaps one key point is, as Andrea just mentioned, that there were commitments of there were challenges of personal assumptions that became challenged, especially at the end when all three futures were compared against each other: the probable, the preferred, and the reframed one. That's kind of the final learning to bring it all together, and that I think led to some personal impacts of changing behavior, as I mentioned. But I think the key thing was questioning about values of the future, and as Andrea had mentioned, I mean, bringing non-human voice into the negotiations. I think before the lab, I mean, I'm really interested in that anyway, but I think what the lab proved and demonstrated was how feasible it actually is to have non-human voices in a climate negotiation, and how important it is to do that. So I think if before the lab, it might be seen as like a legal strategy or something that would be nice, I think that the Futures Literacy Lab proved to the participants that it's totally possible to do it, and it's incredibly important that it happens. So I think that's kind of an outcome, maybe for me personally, but I'd hope for others as well.
Thank you so much, Carl. Andrea, please go ahead.
I have 3 cute arguments to add to Achan Carl. Great analysis. The first one may be about labs of this kind. We had a lot of feedbacks from the participants saying we are more hopeful and optimistic about the future than we were before entering the lab, or even before the first day. We are exiting and leaving this lab being more hopeful about what we can do about climate, about justice. it was not so much about, we gained so much knowledge from previous, from before, because like we said, we were dealing with academics, right? But one thing that maybe academics are losing the more they research is this optimism about the future. And this labs was just 9 hours dedicated to making people realize that, you know, there is many futures and there is many people thinking about the future, maybe in different ways, and being hopeful. And so a lot of pessimism together brought a lot of optimism at the end. So this would be my first point. The second point would be more about the co-facilitators. Just for myself, this last 2 years, I've been quite difficult about achievement, and this opportunity of, you know, building a lab and exchanging with participants and participant acknowledging the work we did was something to be very proud of. And so these labs and the fact that they take in students in the making, or future decision maker in the making, is making also us being more proud of what we're currently studying, and yes, giving us some material to be proud of. The last thing was about people also asking for information about each other. Some people were really keen on meeting afterwards. And I think this is another very great point about the lab, is that even though it was online, people during these 3 days bonded with each other for some. And, you know, being more hopeful at the end, you just, you know, you have this idea of meeting, maybe discussing more about the future, maybe creating an organization, an association, or working together in the future. But this lab also brought this sense of networking with people who think similarly about the future of climate and nature. So very interesting to see how people want to socialize and get together.
Thank you, Andrea. Ha, your hand is also up.
Yes, thank you, Sally, and thank you, Andrea, so much. Actually, my opinion will echo something that he just said. So in terms of outcome, I think, yes, about increasing optimism for everyone among us, that, you know, young people really capable of empowering themselves and their community to make a change. You know, I don't believe that, you know, small and young students like us, like not yet decision makers, can do anything, and imagination can do anything, you know, really important. But after this, my mindset has changed. And the second outcome, you know, as a facilitator, I have a very good opportunities to increase my communication skills and the skill to work with time pressure, to be given new tools to do my project in development now and in the future. And I have a lot of new knowledge about climate change, climate action, climate justice from my friends and teachers, and also unframe my own knowledge and my own perspective about so many problems. So I think this lab is the best way for us to learn as a student, and I would like to thank Ajahn Carl and the IID class to enable me to join this. And I want to thank the UNESCO team for giving us a lot of new knowledge about future literacy and climate change. And about the insight, I think, yes, I will talk short about this. First, the non-human representation need to be considered, as you all said. And a second thing is the role of climate literacy and technology in fighting climate change. So in our discussion, we talk a lot about the fact that everyone knows that climate change is something serious, but they don't know how to relate that into their own condition, their own community. And this lab is a chance for them to speak and to relate to themselves. And all of them believe and imagine that in the future, technology will help us not only to understand non-human beings, but to connect better to each other and help solve the problem. So that is what come up into my mind now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Ha. And I mean, I appreciate you thanking the UNESCO team for offering like FL, although I have to say that all this knowledge that you produce came from all of you as facilitators and came from the participants. And so it actually speaks to your own creativity and the knowledge that you had with inventing new perspectives. We are only here to facilitate the process and to support you in creating that process. I do see some questions in the Zoom chat, and actually the latest one I see is actually directly addressed to Carl. So maybe we can take the last 5 minutes to take audience questions. If anyone else has questions, please drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll address them one by one. So reads, Dear Carl, bring in non-human voices through legal means. I think that is what you said, if I am not mistaken, is strategic and definitely a favorable development. But given that non-anthropocentric thinking also has its roots in pre-modern thinking, philosophies, etc., we also need to use non-human voices to critically look at modernity. Otherwise, we may fail to see far-reaching implications of non-anthropocentric perspectives. What do you think? This sounds like a question that we can go on for hours to chat on, but maybe a quick response from Carl.
I think, I essentially agree with what Toshi has mentioned in this comment, that legal strategies, at least a starting point, such as the rights of rivers, could build a momentum around this, but it also, the discussion needs to move far beyond those kind of what would be probably essentially liberal legal framings of how to understand the interests of rivers. I think probably what I found from the Futures Literacy Lab, we didn't focus that much on the legal strategies, but rather try to give persona and voice to the interests of these non-human things. And I think perhaps that is maybe touching more towards the second part of this question. Like what types of ethics and philosophies, for example, might emerge from learning from rocks and landscapes and rivers and things that live in rivers. So I think it's definitely more than just a legal discussion, although in the human part of the world at least, maybe legislation is still a part of that future. Although I think the reframe that we did in the Futures Literacy Lab actually did challenge some of the assumptions of the way that existing regulatory structures would exist and societal structures create. So this wasn't, sorry, this is probably going too long. This wasn't too much, as Sally predicted. This wasn't actually the focus of the Futures Literacy Lab, but I think it would be a really interesting topic to explore through another Futures Literacy Lab on this type of ethical question.
Thanks, Carl. And I'm being notified that we do need to wrap up quickly. And Michiko will also be speaking shortly to conclude our session together. So to very quickly address the question from the student from Cambodia, what is that, Chula? I would encourage you to reach out to Carl and to the facilitators that you see on screen to look for a way to first be involved in Chula, but in terms of working with universities in Cambodia, we would love to. But let's start with Chula as a starting point. And over to our, I believe, our tech facilitator might have something to add.
Perhaps we can conclude here. Well, thank you very much, Sally, Christine, Ajahn Carl, and all the co-facilitators, the students' contributions, really very special. And I think I totally agree that one of the very key outcomes of this, the Futures Literacy Lab was the co-designing experience itself. And Chulalongkorn University would like to continue conducting the Futures Literacy Lab, maybe not just for the students. This was, with the students this time, but with faculty members or other member sectors from the society. And we're really looking forward to that, future experiences. And thank you very much again for all the support from our colleagues.